Good evening, parents, carers, community members, and any other members of the Forest community who are watching us this evening. Welcome to our Forest Focus webinar on learning strategies in the classroom. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, this is just to remind you that our final webinar for the Michaelmas term, I'm not sure where the time has gone, is on Tuesday the 2nd of December, and that's going to be led by Everyone's Invited. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about that organisation, and we've done a lot of work with them thanks to our phenomenal head of RSHE, Miss Arthur, and they're going to be specifically focusing on supporting your children as parents and carers in a digital age. And I'd really urge you to join in and log in for that excellent webinar. So we are in very safe hands this evening, and we have Mr. Stevenson, who is our Director of Teaching and Learning at Forest. And we're really excited that we're going to be able to share with you, well, he will, because he's got much more expertise than myself, into really clear learning strategies in the classroom and bring that to life for you as parents and carers. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Stevenson. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Really nice to be here to present remotely this evening. And as Mrs. Milton has said, I'm going to be talking about developing metacognitive learning strategies. And the idea behind this is to help your child become a more effective learner. And as Mrs. Milton said, I'm James Stevenson, and my job is Director of Teaching and Learning Development of Forest in the Senior School. And within that role, my remit is all things teaching and learning, including helping teachers to be more effective teachers, but also, and particularly importantly for today's session, helping students to become more effective learners. To start with, let's talk about what we're going to aim to do in the session this evening. We're going to try and do three things. The first one is to develop our understanding of metacognition, what it means, and the three key components that it's comprised of. The next is to consider some practical strategies that can be used to support Forest pupils, your children, in developing metacognitive skills. And then the last thing is to explore some examples of research, and most importantly, some examples of these things in action, good and bad examples. But to begin with, I'd like us to think about this. What do we mean when we say metacognition? Just going to give you a moment to think on your own. Well, if metacognition is a term you're not familiar with, the first thing is it might sound quite daunting, quite complicated. The next thing you might do is look at the word itself and think, meta and cognition, it must be thinking about thinking. If you've heard of it before, you might think, no, it's actually thinking about learning. The truth is it's both of those things. By definition, metacognition is where we think about carefully our own thinking, our cognition, and our learning. But more precisely, it's this. It's any and all activities where pupils plan, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. I think thinking about metacognition in these terms is really helpful. It precisely pinpoints what it is, and at the same time helps to navigate what can appear to be a complicated and daunting term. It's helpful for us, and I think it's helpful for pupils too. So being able to effectively use metacognitive learning strategies is important. It's really important. It improves pupils' independence, enhances their problem-solving skills, and builds their resilience. Not only is this crucial for being an effective pupil, it's also crucial for being an effective, happy, well-rounded, confident human being. There's also research that speaks of the efficacy and importance of metacognition. The Education Endowment Foundation, Flavel and Zimmerman, their research shows that effective metacognitive strategies can add at least 7 months progress to secondary education. That's more than half a year of learning and lessons. Quite staggering. And here's an example of it. This fancy, complicated word, metacognition. But what does that look like in a classroom? Well, if a student were to plan how to tackle a design project before starting it, and then during, carefully monitored what they were doing, and at the end evaluated what worked well and what didn't work so well, they would be using metacognitive strategies. We could choose an example for any subject or domain from any of the subjects offered at Forest. I've chosen design because it happens to fall within the remit of the subjects I teach, art and design. And here's a visualization of metacognition with its three key components surrounding it. We've got planning, moving into monitoring, into evaluating. And what's important about this is it's cyclical. Once the evaluation is complete, we move back in again to that process of planning. Highly effective learning looks like this. Let's talk about those three components. First of all, planning learning. Well, what do we mean? Well, setting goals, choosing strategies, and allocating appropriate time. Helpful ways of approaching planning would be to ask oneself, for pupils to ask themselves, what do I need to do? How long will it take? What resources will help? These are helpful questions. You can support your child by encouraging them to create, for example, short written plans, or ask them the prompt questions above, or share a habit that you have in terms of planning that you think is particularly effective. And at Forest, of course, we also support pupils to plan effectively. Some examples can be through setting specific homeworks or class activities that are focused on the art of planning. In English, this might be planning an essay. In maths, this might be how you would approach a complex equation, a planning strategy surrounding that. Moving into monitoring learning. What do we mean by this? Well, checking, understanding, and progress, but crucially, during the process of learning, typically when we're engaged in a learning task. It's helpful here to ask oneself, do I understand this? Should I change my approach? Is what I'm doing right now working? You can help your child by asking them these reflective questions mid-task, or encouraging them to ask themselves them, saying, when you get halfway through, what are you going to ask yourself? How's that going to help you to understand your success? How can you change things mid-flow if you need to? And at Forest, we support pupils, firstly through something called academic monitoring, which is a discrete opportunity in the academic year on several occasions for pupils to monitor and evaluate their learning. But also this happens on a more day-to-day basis in lessons, for example, by asking pupils to check their progress against success criteria mid-task. Moving on finally to evaluating learning. Here we're talking about evaluating outcomes and strategies after they've been completed. It's helpful here to ask what went well, or what would I do differently next time? Or perhaps what went well and what could have been even better if, a more common school parlance I'm sure you're familiar with and have heard of it. You can help your child here by asking them those reflective questions, but I'd also encourage the importance of why and specificity. What went well? Why? Can you be more specific? What did you find challenging? Why? Can you be more specific? And at Forest, we support pupils to evaluate their learning through academic monitoring and also in-class opportunities. Self-assessment is deeply embedded into all of our curriculum design and lessons. We think it's extremely important that at the end of tasks, pupils have the ability to measure their success, to think about what went well, and crucially, to think about what they could do differently next time, furthering their learning journey. We're going to look at a case study now. This is a semi-fictional case study. The student's name is certainly fictional. I've chosen my name. You may have noticed from the icon below the picture of me here. And this is a fictional example of non-successful metacognitive strategies in action. I call this a non-example. It could be called a bad example. The context is a student called James, who's in year 10, preparing for an end of unit test in English on Of Mice and Men. And the test's going to cover character analysis, themes, and key quotations. I want you to take a moment now and just scan through the What James Does section. Take a moment and have a read, please. Some things you may have noticed. The planning is very, very short. Not much time is allocated to it. And as a result, it's also very vague. It's okay to say we'll plan, but what's important is how well we plan. To say I'm going to read a book and look at my notes is not specific enough. He also doesn't set specific goals. It would be helpful to say I want to revise Lenny's character and 3 key quotes. And preferably, you'd want to choose the areas you are less secure in. I'm going to revise Lenny's character because I know very little about it. Or allocate time for each topic. Hasn't been considered. He also doesn't choose effective strategies. To plan to read is rather passive. It's a good way of exposing yourself to knowledge, but it's not a good way of ensuring you've acquired it. It would be far, far better to ask yourself questions where you were forced to remember facts, or to practice writing an exam-style question where you were forced to not only remember the facts, but also to apply them in the way that's required for the upcoming assessment. He also doesn't check if he's got all of his resources ready prior to the revision, and he starts revising without considering how he'll monitor his progress or areas or assess what he's learned. As a result, midway through, it's very hard for him to say whether what he's planning to do is working or not. Unfortunately, the outcome of this is an hour spent rereading random chapters. It probably felt at the time reassuring. It probably felt to him like he was doing the right thing. He felt busy, but realistically, he has no idea if he's ready for the test. And when he does start the test, he's asked a question about Curly's wife, and because of the inefficient metacognitive strategies used to prepare himself for the test, he fails to recall the quotes or the themes when asked. His planning doesn't lead to focused, productive learning. Overall, the planning was superficial. There was no monitoring and there was no assessment. I want to ask you a question now. What do you think James could have done differently to make his planning more effective? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to just have a think about that. Well, here are my thoughts. Firstly, he should set more specific goals. He should allocate his time more carefully, having considered exactly what he needs to do. He should have chosen active strategies that force him to remember facts, for example, active recall or quiz-style questions or flashcards, and also strategies that encourage him to apply those facts in a way that replicates the conditions and expectations of the assessment, practicing how you'd write the exam question, for example. He also should have gathered resources. Thinking about these things, thinking about the importance of setting specific goals and choosing active strategies, I want you to take a moment now and think, how might you guide your child to do these things as effectively as possible? Imagine all of our responses and thoughts will be nuanced. They're dependent on the children that we're working with. But here are some tips and some suggestions from me that are highly effective in helping students to do that. To ask guiding questions. What exactly do you need to know from this test? How will you know you've learned it? They're good starting points. Suggesting active techniques. Advocating for practice writing a mini essay or using retrieval practice, because we know those things work. They're not passive revision or learning techniques and strategies. It can also be possible, if there's time, to model the process. Sitting with a student for 5 minutes to help them create a clear written plan can be a really, really useful strategy. We're going to move on now to look at a strong example of metacognitive learning strategies in action. The context here is Amelia. She's a Year 9 student preparing for a classics assessment on Greek mythology. She is also fictional, and the test that she's preparing for will cover key gods and goddesses, major myths, and thematic interpretations. Please take a moment and look through what Amelia does. You'll be able to see that her planning is very specific, and she allocates a good amount of time to this. 10 minutes, the revision plan is clear, and she's specifically targeting the revision of Zeus, Athena, and Poseidon, and including 2 key myths for each. I would hope that this student is also choosing Zeus, Athena, and Poseidon because they're areas that are less strong in her knowledge. That would be excellent platinum standard practice. She selects strategies that are active, creating flashcards, which can be used for retrieval practice, summarizing myths, which is another effective form of retrieval practice, and practicing answering one past essay question. She checks she's got all of the resources she needs beforehand, textbooks, class notes, teacher feedback. She monitors her progress after each topic through self-quizzing and makes a note of areas of strength but also areas she struggles with. And at the end, as a result of her monitoring, she's able to evaluate and reflect. She's able to say that she can recall Zeus and Athena easily, but she needs to work on myths surrounding Poseidon. As a result of this, she's able to adjust her planning for the next session. If you think back to the 3 areas surrounding metacognition, we've got planning, monitoring, and evaluating. This is an example where our evaluation informs upcoming planning and really reinforces the cyclical nature of metacognitive processes. As a result of this, Amelia feels confident, and that's because she knows she's mastered and what she's mastered and what she needs to improve. Her revision is focused, active, and measurable. An overall summary: planning focused on clear goals, appropriate use of strategies, effective resources gathered, monitoring of progress that is razor sharp, and to finish off, effective evaluation employed. Thinking about these things, thinking about these excellent examples of metacognitive learning strategies, might be helpful just to take a moment and think about ways you might want to guide your child in using similar strategies. I'll give you about 15 seconds just to have a think. Well, again, the answers here will be complex and nuanced, depending on the people that we're working with. But here's some useful suggestions. It can be really helpful for us to model thinking aloud, to demonstrate how we plan, monitor, and evaluate when thinking and solving problems. I think very few people watching this video will be students themselves, but we still, day to day, plan, monitor, and evaluate. And we're probably quite expert at that. Modeling that to students, to children, can be really effective. It's helpful to teach goal setting, encouraging students to set clear, realistic, achievable goals before starting a task, not something that's overly vague or overly ambitious and unachievable. Modeling and encouraging self-questioning, prompting students to ask questions like, what do I already know? How will I check my progress? Encouraging them to reflect after tasks, help them to review what worked, what didn't, and why, and encourage them to select appropriate strategies. Guide them to choose and adapt strategies based on the task's demands, but also strategies that are effective. Here are a few strategies that are effective, and there's a wide range of these, and we do have lots and lots more of these on our revision strategy SharePoints, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but they're available to all students and parents through the Forest School SharePoint. This is the Learning Scientist's 6 strategies for effective learning. The first is concrete examples. That's where you use a concrete explanation to explain something that's quite abstract and complex. It helps to build a strong mental model that is more memorable and can be useful with retrieval practice. Dual coding similarly boosts and increases and strengthens memory. And that's by pairing visual with written, either an image with text or an image with a verbal explanation. Elaboration is where students write as much as possible about a really, really complicated topic. It's kind of like mind mapping, but as a form of revision too. This is a helpful way of forcing ourselves to retrieve complicated, interconnected information. And then we have interleaving, retrieval practice, and space practice. They're all quite closely connected. Interleaving is where we revisit little bits of topics we've previously covered as courses progress. That helps us to revisit things and to ensure that we're making connections between old knowledge and new, but also that we don't forget old knowledge. This is a form of retrieval practice where we force ourselves to remember things. If we do this really, really well, we are far less likely to forget things. And there's a diagram called the forgetting curve. Essentially what it shows is the more retrieval practice you employ, the longer it takes you to forget something. Eventually in life, unfortunately, we always forget things, but we can delay that process. And the last but not least is space practice. And that's giving us time to forget something before we revisit it and force ourselves to remember it. These are really effective strategies. We also have Ali Abdul, the retrospective revision timetable, and a wide range of other strategies. What he did in this timetable, first of all, I believe it was Cambridge University. He was either one of the highest or the highest scoring students in exams there ever. And that's largely attributed to the strategy he used. He started with topics, not dates. He listed all the subjects he needed to know, rather than planning by calendar dates. That's a really, really specific example of planning. He tracked his past performance, excellent monitoring here, recorded what he'd studied, when, and used the data to decide what needed revisiting. So there's also evaluation moving into more planning. He prioritized weak areas, focused on topics he knew the least, and used color coding ratings to identify gaps. He used active recall or retrieval practice, forcing himself to remember things, and spaced repetition, revisiting these things so he wouldn't forget them, and incorporated those techniques to strengthen memory and understanding over time. And last but not least, he stayed flexible. He avoided a rigid schedule, and he allowed himself to adapt his metacognitive learning processes and his revision based on his performance at any given moment. I've talked a lot today about metacognitive learning strategies and some helpful tips and things you could do to support your children outside of Forest, but I'm going to talk now a little bit about some of the things we do at Forest too. So in lessons, we always ensure there's structured peer assessment. That could be through looking at a model example and asking students to talk about that to build a mental model of what success looks like. Or it could be students giving one another feedback using some kind of prep framework, success criteria, or a marking rubric or marking scheme. We always ensure there's opportunities for structured self-assessment. These can be quite significant opportunities, reflecting on a piece of coursework at a significant deadline, reflecting on an end of unit test, reflecting on an extended essay answer, or something shorter, reflecting on an exit ticket or a small task in a lesson, or a single answer. And we also explicitly teach students exam skills, and as part of that, the metacognitive processes of planning, monitoring, and evaluating. And we do that through our exams readiness cycle, which is approaching fast for students in Key Stage 4 and 5. And outside of lessons, we ensure that there's revision trackers and revision resources. These boost pupils' metacognitive processes. We have academic monitoring, which I've mentioned earlier, and that's an opportunity for students to really, really sit down, start with the monitoring, then evaluating their progress, and then using that to plan their next steps in their learning to adjust their strategies. And also, in addition to class teachers, heads of department, we mustn't forget the important role that tutors and heads of house play in these processes. Tutors and heads of house arguably know students better than other members of staff in the school. They spend a significant amount of time with them, often seeing them at least twice every day. They have a great insight into people's strengths and areas for development, and many of their interventions support pupils in developing the skills to plan, monitor, and assess their own learning. A final note from me. This is our Forest Learner framework. It's a framework that discusses all of the skills and attributes a successful pupil at Forest has. And you can see that a range of these relate to metacognition. For example, from responsibility, taking responsibility for academic progress. From strategies, talking about and using a range of skills and strategies to help them learn. Acting as their own teacher. Actively asking and acting on feedback. Giving feedback to themselves. Constructing their own success criteria. Engaging with success criteria and learning intentions. Knowing what success looks like. And describing how well their work meets the success criteria. Metacognitive processes and learning strategies are very, very deeply embedded into the teaching and learning culture at Forest. Now, that's it from me. If there are any questions, I know there's a chat function here. I'd be delighted to take them. If people don't want to ask questions now, but they think they would like to later, my email's here. And if you're watching this video non-live and you're looking at the video that's been uploaded to SharePoint, my email's there too, and I'd be really delighted to get back to any questions you may have via email. So I'll end things there, Mrs. Milton, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, sir. There's no questions at the moment, but if any come through, then I'll make sure that we forward them to you. Thank you so much, and for joining us and giving us so much insight and so much for parents and carers to digest at home and use with their children, especially in time for as we get to mock season for some of our old pupils at Forest. So just takes me this opportunity to wish you a wonderful evening, and once again, thanks, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.